Alternatively, you can go to the Harrison, which is on 28 Harrison Street in King's Cross in London, and go and see Stuart Langridge and Dave Megaslip as part of Force Talk. Man, I love the fact that he's called Dave Megaslippers.
Good morning, boys and girls. Welcome to episode 64 of Bad Voltage. My name is Bryan Lunduke, and I'm joined by three bastards. Creepy. Hey, Jono, what are we talking about today?
I just want to apologize before we get started for whatever that was, everybody. So first of all, we're going to talk about the exciting announcement that got loads of press recently, which is Bash running on Windows, but more specifically, a big chunk of the Ubuntu archive running on Windows. Like, why are Microsoft doing this? Why are Canonical doing this? And what do we think about it?
Also in this episode, Jono is going to review the iRig Pro.
And we're going to talk about AppImage and other methods of distributing software to Linux desktops, and whether they're a good idea or whether we should remain shackled to the mid-90s.
Yes, and before we go on, I also just want to make a small apology for the fact that I am currently sat in a hotel room. So if it sounds a bit weird for this show, for various reasons, content included, it's because this is a somewhat travel show. So, yeah.
I was going to end this intro in that creepy voice that Bryan started with, but I just don't think I could pull it off. So
you really should.
And now.
Oh, my God.
Bad Voltage. So, as I am sure everyone listening to this show and pretty much everyone in the open source universe will have recently heard, Microsoft recently had their Build Developer Conference, and in that during that conference, they made an announcement that, I'll read it directly from the slide, Bash is coming to Windows. And exactly what that means is that the Ubuntu user space, and I don't know why they keep saying Bash Shell so specifically, and Bash Shell.
I know, that is weird, isn't it?
It is a very weird thing to
Yeah, I know.
It's running natively on Windows 10. So I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from, this is Justin Kirkland's blog. So what it is Windows 10 users can open the Windows Start menu and type either Bash or Ubuntu, and they'll open a cmd.exe console, but that's running the full Ubuntu bin bash with access to all of Ubuntu's user space. And so that means, as he says, you get apt and rsync, find, grep, aux, pretty much anything in Ubuntu, and most of the tens of thousands of binary packages available in the Ubuntu archives. And this is not a VM, it's not a container, it's just native using what was called the Windows
Subsystem for Linux.
Yeah.
Yes, the WSL.
I mean, from what I understand, they go to fairly great lengths to say this is not virtualized. This is Ubuntu without the kernel. That's what I've had a bunch of Microsoft people say to me.
It's like Ubuntu without checksum for checksum Ubuntu ELF binaries, not anything recompiled, which is what's different from Cygwin.
It's basically Wine except in reverse. It's a Linux kernel emulator or more likely a Linux kernel process translator that So then they work with Canonical.
Given all that, what do you guys think?
It's great for Windows users. Sorry, I'll rephrase.
Why?
It's great for Windows developers.
Why?
Because having done work with a whole bunch of teams, some of whom have Windows, some of whom Mac, some of whom Linux users, the way it tends to work is the Mac and Linux people are all using the same software. They're pulling it from the same repositories. You're writing little scripts to stitch everything together, and they're always bash scripts they'll shell out to do things. And the Windows people are kind of fighting to put together a little Cygwin-ish terrible semi-Linux environment, or they're running Ubuntu in a VM.
So what you're saying is it's handy to be able to have the same version of the Git command line tool across platforms. I mean, basically, right?
Absolutely, it is.
So this is the thing that gets me, because it's not identical to running on a production environment. You couldn't really use this, not really, as a production environment. That's not
absolutely not.
So you're not going to be developing on it and having a great level of confidence that the way things run would run the same. You're also not getting GUI tools.
There's
a lot you're not getting.
Hang on. Remember, almost everyone out there who's doing development which is then deployed separately. I'm primarily a web guy, right? So think about just my industry for now. Basically everyone out there, to a first approximation, is developing on a Mac and deploying on Linux. So we're already in the situation where your development environment and your deployment environment are not identical. What this does is it makes Windows, a Windows environment, just as plausible a developer environment in that situation as a Mac is. Yeah. It's a bloody masterstroke by Microsoft. Stop everyone just going out and buying Macs because they need them for the developer tools.
The other thing as well, I think it would be fair to say this. So the other thing as well is Microsoft have made it quite clear that, this thing isn't finished yet and not everything is running. So it's not like you can take the entire Ubuntu archive and everything is guaranteed to run today. I mean, so for example, anything that's depending on X, because the first thing I thought when I saw this was like, I wrote this blog post a little while back about the idea of a hybrid desktop, which I think would be quite cool. And I thought, brilliant, hybrid desktop on Windows. But there isn't an X layer for this yet. But from what I can tell, for some of the things in there, you can use it in a production setting. Now, you don't want to be, you don't want to be hosting web services or anything like that. You wouldn't want this production in a DevOps sense. But from the perspective of somebody who's like wants to install, some, like if you want to install Python or something like that on your Windows box and you want to develop with it, then it can be used in a production setting in that sense. And I'm assuming their goal is to get it to a point where everything in that archive runs at the box and it runs well.
To me, yeah, fine, it doesn't run X apps, but that's not an interesting use case. It's that they're not targeting whatever insane user goes, what I want is the stability of Windows as my desktop platform with all the wonderfulness of the Linux desktop, right? No one wants that. No one alive wants that to be their computer.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. I mean, I get that.
No, it is, in my opinion, for developers, because the Microsoft people have seen a massive hemorrhage of developers. Basically, every developer you see now uses a Mac, right? And they're worried about that. They're genuinely worried. I'm sure they are. And this massively arrests that. People are like, well, I don't want to use Windows because I want access to all the tools. I want to be able to just check stuff out of GitHub really easily, not have to change all the dashes to slashes in the command line, not try to set up Sigwin in order to make things work, not have it throw a wobbler every time I feed it a bash script, which is of more than moderate complexity. Right? But everyone goes to the Mac because they're not going to go to Linux because, desktop, people aren't happy with it, whatever. This stops them having to do that. And there are a shed load of developers.
Does it stop them from doing that? Because I would agree with you that my first kind of gut was, is this embrace, extend, and extinguish? And I don't think it is, and I think that we're getting to a point that if you bring up E every time Microsoft does something new, you're getting more and more anachronistic, I think, and I try not to do that. Even though you look at the history of Microsoft doing deals like this between what they did with Apple and then coming out with Windows, what they did with IBM, and then coming out with NT, what they did with Sybase and then coming out with SQL Server, what they did with Sun and then coming out with J++, and then they get sued, and then they came out with .NET. I mean, they do have a pretty long history of deals pretty close to this deal.
Yeah.
But I think this is a different Microsoft, and I think their developers, their senior developers, their execs go to conferences, go to OSCON, and see nothing but MacBook Pros.
Yes.
Or MacBook Airs.
Yes.
Everywhere.
Right.
And that has to be a little alarming. So I would agree with you that the reason for this probably is developers. That said, do you think this will stem that particular tide?
I think it's a necessary but not sufficient component to stem that tide.
Because
if you were a Microsoft person and you went to people and said, well, why are you using a Mac? They said, but I want access to all these tools. But if you then said, well, you could just use Ubuntu or Fedora and get access to those tools, or why'd you pick a Mac? They then say, here's a load of other stuff that I want. I want Photoshop, and I want it not to crash, and I want pretty graphics, and so on. I want a sense that everything works together. And the Windows people haven't cracked that yet. But again, I don't particularly think...
But this isn't really cracking anything all by itself either, because this doesn't actually accomplish anything new that couldn't have been accomplished the day before it existed.
I disagree with you completely.
No,
I think
because
I think you guys are coming from two different perspectives, and that's why I think as a web developer, this changes the game for you. If you're not you specifically, but a Windows-based web developer, I think this changes the game. If you are a Windows developer, I don't think this does anything for you.
No, I agree with you completely. I don't think anyone who's developing Windows apps
and wait a minute. And what way does it change the game? Because literally, you can run way less software on this than you could in any virtualization or container type technology you could dream up.
I agree with you.
Way less software.
However,
but the native workflow, I think,
developing in a VM is a pain in the arse.
Yeah. But there's no practical difference that I can see between the workflow of having this in a VM with a shared folder structure and a shared clipboard and this. It's otherwise the same, right? Except in a VM you get more software.
The experience of working in a VM is crappy, and developers don't want to be living in it.
This is way worse. Think about this for a second. There is no difference between this and having a VM with a full screen, completely X11 free terminal session. That's the experience you get with this new setup. It's just a terminal. You just get all the command line apps, and that's great. Those are great apps. But what couldn't you do already with the exact same workflow?
Just because yes, you can achieve the same thing with virtualization
in the same way.
That
in the exact same way.
That's not.
Hang on. Just you can experience the same thing with virtualization doesn't mean it's the same, right? The developer experience is not the same. Right?
Okay, show me specifically what is specifically the different use case, like the thing you can do now that you couldn't do before, or dramatically easier or better.
Here's the thing I will pick from less than 2 weeks ago.
Sure.
Right, working with a client and the developers at that client, and we were running into problems because their machines were behind an HTTP proxy.
Okay,
and they couldn't work out why the test suite was failing. And the reason the test suite was failing was because the test suite wasn't being told about the HTTP proxy. And they said, why? But the proxy's configured. But it was configured at the operating system level, but not in the VM. When you had to configure a completely... They were running Ubuntu in a VM, and I had to tell them this is how to configure a system-wide proxy in Ubuntu, which they didn't know and shouldn't have to know. That's the difference between working in a VM and working on your actual native operating system.
But you can do that one time within whatever the virtualization tool is, like VirtualBox or VMware, and have that automatically set up for all your virtual machines. So it's
so
not
you've already got to learn twice. That's just one thing.
Well, it's not learning twice. Are you seriously going to tell me that if a developer, a web developer, does not know has no concept of what a proxy is, and added in once?
No, but he probably doesn't have a proxy of VirtualBox or doing it in Linux.
They know exactly what a proxy is, and they have configured the proxy in the operating system they have chosen to use. That's like me saying to you, well, you know how to configure an HTTP proxy in GNOME or whatever it is you're using today. Do you know how to do it in Windows? No. Why
no,
should
but
you
it
have
will
to
literally
learn?
take maybe 60 seconds of Googling. And I'm done, and I do it once, and I'm done. Like, there's no...
Yeah, but
I get what you're saying. It does save 60 seconds, but so far I've only seen 60 seconds of time saving. It saves you 60
seconds if you know what the problem is, because they didn't even know what the problem was. They didn't know what to Google.
And they're probably not developers in the first place, so why would they even need this tool at all?
It saves you 60 seconds for each individual thing you need to do that you already know how to do in the environment you've chosen.
Also, And I just realized this, if they're web developers and they're spending all their time on Windows, they're going to have to relearn friggin' everything because now they're in a brand new environment, right? They're having to learn how to use Bash. They're having to learn how to do shell scripting there. So why is that not a problem? But having to know how to paste a proxy URL is a problem.
It is a problem for them. The distinction is they want to learn about that stuff, right? Because
they don't want to know what a proxy is?
No, they're interested in learning about new tools, about the things that the rest of the industry are using. When I say developers, I think this is primarily targeted at people who aren't really choosing to use Windows, but have to. Basically, in my head, the developer target for this is people who work for a company of over 500 people and they're not allowed a Mac. But they don't want to say, well, then we have to use classic ASP to write everything, right? They want to be able to use new tools and don't want to have to buy into .NET. So they want to say, well, we want to use Node. Have you tried setting that stuff up on Windows? It's a nightmare. But this suddenly becomes
that's
easier.
True.
You probably find they use a Mac at home, but now they've got that same environment at work, but they haven't moved to Macintosh. So the company can still stick with their Windows-only policy, which keeps the Microsoft people very happy, rather than saying, well, okay, you're allowed a Mac because you're a developer, at which point, 10 years from now, everyone at that company has a Mac and Windows have no sales.
Forget Macs, because technically, Macs have nothing to do with this. Not directly. We're talking about a Linux subsystem.
No, I think Macs led directly to the decision for Microsoft to do this. They have everything to do with this.
I'm just saying, from a usable perspective, I still am not seeing any value here.
But Brian, I think the thing you're missing out on here is that, in my mind, is that this is, yes, you make a good point, Brian, that you can achieve and accomplish the same things in almost any situation without this thing. I agree with you. Like, you can install Node, you can install Python
with a better workflow.
Right, whatever, you can install those things, you can set those things up. The point is, this is all about convenience, right? This is about making it easier. And while it may only be
there's actually
60
more steps in setting this up.
But hang on. What I'm saying is that right now, I would imagine in the eyes of Microsoft, the use case, the issue that they want to address here is somebody thinks to themselves, okay, I want to have a completely integrated, well-supported, popular developer workflow setup, and they go out and they buy a Mac, right? And if they had Windows previously, you can set it up, but it's a faff for a lot of these things, right?
Sure.
And one of the benefits that we always talk about in the Linux world, and I think we can thank the people in Debian for a lot of this as well, is you've got this massive archive of well-supported, well-integrated software. So bridging those two worlds seems like a reasonable thing for Microsoft to do, in the same way that, like, on a Mac, when you install and set up Homebrew, it makes the overall Mac experience a lot better because you've got this big archive of software that you can just set up. So to me, yes, you can accomplish those things. This is all about convenience and the convenience that, so to Ack's point, I think.
But it doesn't reduce the number of steps. It doesn't actually reduce the number of things you have to do.
It makes it easier
it's
to do.
almost nearly identical.
I think it makes it, no. Are you telling me that you don't think this makes it more convenient for people?
Oh, absolutely
there's
not.
No additional convenience benefit.
Absolutely not. And here's multiple reasons why. To start with, you can either you can get the Linux subsystem and then go into the Windows application store and install the closed source, not released as open source, Ubuntu version for Windows, and get just a selected subset curated by Canonical of the tools that will be made available. Not all of them. It's really not all of them. It's just a very limited subset. Is it a lot? Yes, but it's not all of them. So when you start doing things and you start hopping online and seeing how to do things, how to tie different applications together to achieve specific results, you're not going to have access to things that most people achieving those results on Debian or Ubuntu have access to. If you do the alternative...
This isn't for people who want to run general Linux.
No, I agree with you.
Not for those people, because those people would then
I agree.
Just be
These are developer workflow issues. Developer workflow issues. 90% of what developers do is hopping online, looking through forums, going to Google, finding code, and figuring out how to do shit. Now... This limits their options. If they simply fired up a VM with whatever distro they wanted, even just the same version of Ubuntu, but they have more packages available to them, better support available to them, and then they actually have more functionality. They can do things like snapshotting and whatnot for their environments that you can't do in the subsystem. You actually have less functionality here and more work.
I think that's great. 90%. 90% of like developer requirements here are going to be JavaScript, Python, Ruby, right? And
that's fine.
Things,
but the
right?
goal of this is to
and I think what they'll do
people.
is they'll make sure that stuff is working. And yeah, some of like you might not have some open source version of Fortran that's going to work necessarily out of the box. Yeah, but I suspect that Microsoft just want to make sure that if you can install Python and every Python dash whatever library in Ubuntu, that will serve the Python use case pretty well.
I agree with you, but I'm not sure that's the point. Brian, the argument you're making, okay, I accept the fact that you might find some of the Ubuntu user space isn't available yet, and if you try and install it with apt, it won't work. Fine, no problem. Your argument to me, it feels exactly like being a knockdown argument against wine for the same reason, because you're never going to get as good an experience running something on your Linux desktop with wine as you are firing up Windows.
No, huge
hang
difference.
on, let me finish.
Huge difference.
Let me finish. Because you're always going to get a much better, more integrated experience firing up Windows in a VM. I agree with that. And it's not actually any more steps, and wine is sometimes hard to configure. But
yes.
I never run Windows stuff in a VM. Right? I always just fire up with wine if I need to run something because of the convenience of it. Right? Even though I get a slightly less good and potentially more compromised experience, in general, it's just easy because I just go click, bang, there it is. I don't have to set up a VM. I don't have to make sure that the VM can see the network and all of that stuff, right? Doing stuff in virtualization, unless you're going to go full screen and go, I'm going to immerse myself in that environment, to me, is much less convenient. And if we're saying, well, you should go VM and immerse yourself in that environment, what you actually mean is we're closetly trying to make people become Linux users, which they don't want to do. Maybe they should want to, but they don't.
No, that's a fair point. I can see where Microsoft wouldn't want that. I totally get that. I don't 100% get Canonical's approach here for releasing a closed source version of Ubuntu on Windows. That's a little bit weird to me. I have problems with that.
Well,
I have both ethical and strategy problems with that. I get Microsoft's approach though.
Yeah, I was going to say let's go in that direction then, because I think
I have a kind of large question about that, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. We've spent the first half of this discussing why Microsoft would do this. And I think, we might disagree on some of it, but I'm reasonably confident in my own head that this is to stop the outflow of developers to Macs and so on, but whatever. That's why Microsoft do this.
Okay.
You can come up with a bunch of reasons why they're doing it, but that's why they're doing it.
You know what, Stuart? I buy into that. I just think the idea is stupid. But I bet you're right that is the logic.
But the thing I think is interesting is this is Microsoft saying, okay, we're losing market share and we're losing mind share and we need to stop the enemy, and our enemy is Mac OS X here. And that's fine, I accept that. What I don't quite understand is why Canonical have done it, because this doesn't benefit Ubuntu over Mac OS X. It doesn't benefit Ubuntu over Windows.
Nope.
It does, however, benefit Ubuntu over Red Hat.
Yep.
Or Ubuntu over SUSE. And it seems a bit like Ubuntu are seeing other Linux distros as the people who need to be beaten, and we're not concentrating on beating the actual enemy, who are, Android and iOS and Windows and Mac OS.
Yeah. I have a theory. I don't 100% understand why, but I have a theory why this might be the case.
I'm so excited to hear this theory.
Right. One is, the first area is, I think one thing that we've been seeing more and more of from the Canonical camp has been supporting developers, right? So, Mark often talks about how most Android developers are using Ubuntu, and you've got things like Ubuntu Make, which doesn't just support, various open source or like kind of Linuxy kind of developer environments, but it also has things like, Visual Studio Code in there, all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
So I think developers is definitely a key piece. And I think that one element here is going to be just making, even though it's running on Windows, the value is still the Ubuntu archive, right? So I think Canonical may be moving away from the notion that if you expect everybody to be using Ubuntu, you're only going to get so far. And that's why, Juju supports multiple different clouds, or you can use Juju on other operating systems. And I think that multi-platform element is one aspect of this. The second aspect, and this is complete speculation, is if the rumors are true that maybe Microsoft is interested in, like, there's been rumors for a while about Microsoft being interested in acquiring some or all of Canonical, then broadening out into that world isn't going to hurt, right? And so while it might not make sense from a pure Ubuntu desktop or Ubuntu server perspective, having more people using Ubuntu and potentially lining up Canonical as an acquisition target, it does serve those two, is my theory.
So that was actually going to be one of my questions, is do you think, and I'm interested in all three of you answering this, do you think this is the first toe dip into a potential acquisition of, probably like you said, part of Canonical, not the whole company, by Microsoft?
No idea. I have no idea. Everyone who I've spoken to at Canonical, and I believe them, these are people who I know and trust, has made it pretty clear that, like, they're not aware of any plans in motion. I mean, not that they'd tell me, but I don't know. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, look, Microsoft just acquired Xamarin. They're obviously seriously going after the developer space. Yep. And Ubuntu, I think Ubuntu is a very logical step for them because, I mean, Ubuntu is dominating the cloud.
No. That's actually, Ubuntu's dominating the free cloud. They're a very, very bit player in the paid cloud space. I mean, Red Hat, SUSE, and a couple other companies absolutely just crush Canonical in those spaces.
What do you mean by paid cloud space?
So there's a big difference between if you count every single instance of every operating system that gets spun up on Amazon and Azure and all the various clouds, Canonical crushes. They're the champion with, like, it's crazy. I can't remember what the number is. It's like 80% or 70%. It's huge numbers. If you take away all the just people downloaded a copy of Ubuntu and spun it up on a free instance of, say, EC2 and then forgot about it, and you cut all those out, Canonical and Ubuntu's usage drops down way down low. And it's not minuscule. It's still very worthwhile for them to pursue from a business perspective, but it's way lower than their competitors. Like, they're the bit
But that's what I'm
player
saying, like...
So, but if you're Microsoft, though, and you're looking at a revenue perspective of let's be active within the Linux and containery and Dockery open source space, Canonical's probably the fifth or sixth one you would think about talking to in terms of achieving profitability in those areas.
Yeah,
so I think I agree with you.
Yeah, but put it this way. Microsoft is not... I mean, obviously, Microsoft is very unlikely that they're going to be able to acquire Red Hat. SUSE maybe. I remember reading somewhere that something like 60% of workloads on Azure, I think, are running Ubuntu. So I'm not saying Ubuntu's dominating
if you count
everything.
the free stuff, if you count the free stuff, that is true. If
I'm
you
just
count
saying
free
that,
stuff,
like,
it's true.
I'm just saying that, like, I can imagine that it's interesting.
So,
you know?
I think, though, you're right. Everyone I've talked to has said no to the no word of acquisition, no interest. We're not pursuing it, and I don't think it is. I think this is another example of the Canonical approach of let's load absolutely every bit of buckshot into the musket we can, fire it, and see which ones hit. I mean, it's like, TVs. I mean, Canonical didn't exactly make a big splash in the TV market, but they tried. They approached the phone market from, we're on their third different angle now. They keep changing the desktop approach. Like, every 6 months or so, there's a new approach, a new market. Let's try something new. And some of them stick and some of them don't. And I think this is just another example of them kind of trying something out, seeing how it fits and seeing what works with it. And I think it's a stupid idea. I think it's profoundly stupid. I think I can see a couple of cool things in it, but overall I think it's dumb.
Clearly established that.
I have so many issues with it. But I think it's just an example of trying.
I would say that
new.
Bryan Lunduke is in no way biased against Canonical in any way, as the Bad Voltage history
I like Canonical. They just keep doing stupid shit all the time. But they do good stuff too. But like this one, like, there's a big difference between this and, what they're doing, say, in the cloud. Like, Juju is weird, but it's becoming a little bit more interesting and successful. I think this is just another approach. They're just trying something new, seeing how it fits.
I think everything that Canonical is doing, in my mind, strategically makes sense. The question is whether you think what the specifics of what they're doing is the right way of doing it. So, for example, Juju, it makes sense for Canonical to identify a way to orchestrate and deliver software to the cloud. It makes sense for Canonical to, in the interest of this convergence, to provide a single operating system that runs across these different devices. It makes sense to bring that archive to other operating systems. The question is whether you think the specific implementation and the specific operation of that is the right way of doing it. So I don't think that strategically they're making poor decisions, but everyone's got their own viewpoint on whether that's the right way of doing it. But, each to their own, right?
The reason that I think they're making poor decisions is because I can't tell what direction they're going in. Because every 5 minutes, they're going in a completely different direction, and they never seem to make that much progress into them other than in the Linux desktop market share space, which they haven't really made progress in quite a few years.
I disagree with that. I mean, I know I sound like I'm harping on about developers the whole time, but I think this is a developer
It's okay. Developers are people too, and we like them, so it's okay.
I think this is a developer mindshare thing. Microsoft obviously wanted to do this, right? The Windows subsystem for Linux could have been done in partnership with basically anybody. I mean, they could have done it themselves, for God's sake. They could just download a copy of Small Linux from
and for a very long time they did, right? I mean, Windows services for Unix services for Windows.
They've had multiple incarnations of it that they've abandoned.
Yes, they have, absolutely. The Windows subsystem for POSIX, exactly as Brian says, existed years and years ago on NT4. Which is fine. Yeah. But you need to partner with someone, and I think going with Ubuntu is the most sensible thing because, in general, although, professional DevOps people might not be using it, and when you're doing paid cloud deployments, maybe people are going, no, well, we'll go with someone else. In general, if people want to do a thing and deploy to Linux, the first thing they reach for is Ubuntu. And therefore, I think Canonical want to keep Ubuntu at the top of that that's what we reach for developer mindset. Even if they then go, okay, we're now doing a 10,000 instance deployment, let's do it on Debian or Red Hat with our support contract or whatever. They want to be at the top of developers' minds.
And one thing, just as a final thought from me, I guess, is one thing I think is cool about this is I like seeing this greater sense of cooperation between different companies. Like, you could argue that traditionally Microsoft has looked at things from a very, very Microsoft viewpoint, and the twain shall not meet with other groups. And one of the things I dig here is that the idea of Microsoft working more collaboratively with someone like Canonical, I think makes sense. And critics of Canonical have accused Canonical over the years of looking at things from too much of an Ubuntu perspective, or for building, Canonical building its own technology like Juju or Unity or whatever. So to me, this is I think it reflects well on both companies.
Well, I mean, I'm interested. Jeremy posed the question: do you think this is kind of taking a little sidestep towards an acquisition or something? But what do you actually think, Jezzo? It's not impossible to reach that conclusion, certainly, but everyone's denying it.
Right. I don't think that it's surprising that Microsoft chose Ubuntu for this amongst the other partners. I think it makes, if they were not going to do it themselves, I think Ubuntu makes by far the most sense. Where the partnership goes from there, given Microsoft's history and given the things that I think Ubuntu wants to accomplish, I don't know what that means. I think it could easily go either way.
Outside of my love of the communitar and open source, music is my passion. For many years I've been playing guitar, and I've always had some kind of recording setup at home. Back in the dim distant ages, it was the humble 4-track recorder, and these days it's a computer-based setup. While my home studio is a fancy pants recording interface, sometimes I just want to plug my guitar in and play. This struck me recently when I thought about how nice it could be to hang out downstairs on the couch and play some tunes. Thing is, I just don't want to drag my guitar amp down there and have it potentially destroyed by a 3-year-old. This is when I discovered the iRig Pro. Put simply, the iRig is a little box that you use to plug your guitar into a computer, iPad, or iPhone. The iRig Pro features an input for an instrument or an XLR mic, and it includes a decent quality digital to analog converter. It also supports MIDI and includes a socket with cables to plug it into a computer with USB or an Apple device with either Lightning or that big old wonky Apple connector. Other iRig devices also support Android. While plugging in a guitar into a computer is pretty cool, the real magic comes when you combine it with amp modeling. The companion app that goes with iRig is called Amplitube, and essentially provides a bunch of simulated guitar amps for popular models including Mesa Boogie, Fender, Engel, Orange and others. Amplitube is available for Apple and Android devices, but sadly not for Linux. The iRig itself works admirably. You plug it in, and your guitar is available as an audio input. From there, you can route it to whichever app you want. I tested it first with the Mesa Boogie amp pack in Amplitude for the iPad. As a long-time fan of Boogie amps and a former owner of a Triaxis and a Simulclass 290, I know the Boogie tone pretty well, and the amps didn't sound half bad. For jamming and practicing, they seem more than adequate. For recording, I'm not so sure about that. I also tested Amplitude on my Mac with the free amps available, and again, decent results. As a final test, I plugged it into GarageBand and used the lower quality wide selection of amps there, and got decent results. Overall, latency was pretty low. So, the thing works, but of course the quality of the tone will depend heavily on what software you're using. For my purposes though, just jamming and learning songs, it works great. Hardware-wise, the iRig Pro seems reasonable. Sometimes I would have to replug it in a few times to get it to register, but that might be a software issue. But it worked pretty well every time I've used it. Now, it does feel a little cheap and plasticky, and probably wouldn't hold up well on tour, but anyone who uses this thing for touring is bonkers. Use a real amp. So, what is the bad voltage verdict? The iRig Pro is a great option for home musicians who want a cheap and simple way to get some decent guitar tone for jamming and practicing. While a little plasticky to the touch, the iRig won't survive the rigours of the road, but it will survive the rigours of the sofa.
So my first question is, you say cheap and easy. What is the price?
I think I got it for, I think it was about $100. I mean, I think retail, it's, I think somewhere in the region of about $140 for the Pro version.
Okay.
But it was cheaper on Amazon. So I got that. That's part of the reason why I got the Pro, is because they knocked like $30 or $40 off.
But this is not a Jono Bacon special price or anything. You bought it like an ordinary consumer, just from somewhere cheaper.
Yeah. No, there was no. This is not an endorsement.
Just checking. Jono Bacon is sponsored by iRig Pro.
I mean, the one thing, because I wasn't familiar with this device, I have a M Audio mobile pre that I use for my stuff, which is not nearly as mobile.
Yeah.
Ironically, by the name, as this thing seems to be. The one thing I'll say, if you're into something like this and haven't seen this device, they really did get the size into something that you could easily just toss in your pocket and bring wherever you want. Like you said, you wouldn't want to tour with it. You'd be absolutely bonkers to tour with this thing. But for something just to have laying around for ease of use, it looks like a pretty cool device, actually. I may consider picking one up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I dig about it is, for years, the idea of plugging a guitar or a mic into a computer has been a challenge. And years ago, you'd have to buy a big, bulky recording interface, and the compatibility would vary, and what kind of USB ports you'd have would vary. And this thing seems to work pretty good in that regard. So, again, one of the reasons why I think the Pro is nice is that you can actually plug an XLR mic in, so you could use it for podcasting or something else. So, like I said in the review, in my home studio, I've got like a big recording interface with multiple outputs and all that kind of stuff. So this isn't really a good replacement for that. But if you just want to plug something into a computer and record, so if you're a podcaster or a musician and you just want to get some like tracks down, I think it's pretty good. So.
Right, okay, here we go with Langridge's remedial audio class, so bear with me. I'm not quite following. I'm sure everyone who's listening to this who actually, has more musical ability than a rubber hammer understands all this completely. So I'm not quite following whether what it is it just connects your guitar to your computer and all the work is on the computer. So, I mean, I used to have a thing which was from Shure, and you could plug an XLR mic into it, and it had a USB output.
Yeah.
And you could plug that, so it turned a random XLR mic into a USB mic. Is it one of those, or is it actually a thing that does musical manipulation and B's an amp and so on itself?
No, it's basically the same thing. It's basically a converter. The difference with it, so there is a cheaper iRig model, which you can actually, interestingly, you can actually build these things from a fairly simple set of parts. There's actually schematics and stuff online for how you can take a guitar plug and stick it into a computer. And the cheaper iRig model, which is about $30, does that. So it's all analog. So you can get a lot of background hum and noise. This one's a little bit more advanced because it's got an analog to digital converter in it. So, it will take the guitar which is obviously analog, and it will convert it into something that can be shoved into a computer. So I think, so it does add a little bit of extra. And I think your Shure thing that you had those years ago when we used to do log radio, I think that thing, or Shot of Jack rather, that was the same kind of thing. It had an analog.
So this is conceptually, it's a lead with a guitar on one end and a USB plug on the other. And the fact that the cleverness in the box is to do with keeping the sound quality good and so on. It's not like, because I thought at first when you were describing it, you know those Zoom H1 recorder things with the two little mics on the top that you can use for mobile doing interviews and stuff?
Yes, it's not that.
I thought it was like that for a guitar, so you plug the guitar into it and then it could be an amplifier and so on. But no, it's not like that.
No, this is an interface. And the thing is as well with guitar, this is less, well, it is important for recording microphones, but with the guitar, what's really important is low latency. You know, so what happens is you stick this thing into the USB port, you plug your guitar into the thing, and you play a note, and that means that the guitar sound is going in through the iRig Pro into your computer, into some software like Amplitube or GarageBand or whatever. It then goes through an amp simulator, which takes that clean guitar sound and makes it sound like a Marshall or a Mesa Boogie amp or whatever, and then it spits it out through the headphones, through your headphones or through speakers. You obviously want that entire process to happen instantly because you have a tiny bit of latency with anything musical, and it's just garbage. And that's one of the things that was the big test with this, is like the latency is really low. It actually, bizarrely, it actually performed best in GarageBand. I had a couple of latency issues here and there with Amplitube on the Mac. On the iPad, it worked like flawlessly. So,
right.
You know, so it's a pretty efficient device.
So Amplitube and the iRig Pro are not necessarily a matched pair. You can use the iRig Pro without using Amplitube and use any recording device, any recording software you've got. And similarly, presumably, if you had something which did an iRig Pro style thing but not the iRig Pro, you can still feed that through Amplitube and have it sound like a Fender amp or whatever if you want. Do Fender make amps? They make guitars, Marshall amp.
They do make amps, yeah. I believe... You mentioned Remedial. It's okay. There are no silly questions.
Shut up!
Yeah, I mean...
You condescending bastard.
No, I mean, I believe you can plug anything into Amplitude. I think it's just a regular audio input. So, you know, you could use another device and use it with Amplitude. What's exciting with this, with modern music, particularly with guitars, is the quality of amp modeling is getting really good. So... You know, years ago, if you wanted to record, an album, you had to own a room full of mics, a room full of amps. You know, so the modern rock sound is the Marshall JCM sound. But then the modern metal sound is the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier sound. And sometimes you want a mixture of both or whatever. So with amp modeling, it means that you've got a library of amps that are available, and then you can obviously tune them, and they also simulate things like cabinets and mic placement and all kinds of stuff. It's still not the same as a proper amp. I mean, and it probably never will be the same, but it's closer to that than I've ever seen before. So you can arguably go out and buy one of these things and plug it in, you know, for $100 or whatever, and you can actually get, you know, you spend $25 or $100 or whatever it is on all the amps that you want, and you could arguably get close enough to having thousands of dollars worth of amps.
If you do that, if you use Amplitube or something which simulates, say, a Marshall amp, are the people building that doing it by just twiddling some numbers in a machine till they think it sounds like a Marshall amp, or are they actually licensing the Marshall sound and working with Marshall themselves, and Marshall gets some money back?
It depends. So, for example, with Amplitube, you don't see any Marshall amps in there, but you'll see something called the Brit 8000, right, which is
because presumably you've got to license the name, but the question is, do they also not only do they license the name for trademark purposes, but do they actually work with the amp company to say, does this really sound like your amp? How can we make it sound more like your amp?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that any amp company is not going to put their name on it unless they feel like it represents that quality.
Right.
So, you know, for example, Marshall's a good example. I mean, Marshall, arguably the most popular brand in all of
which is why
amps.
I've heard of them, right? Which tells you something.
Right. Yeah, it's always, it's behind every major rock band when they play live. So, for example, Marshall have licensed their sound, and you can, I think it's by Softtube, and so you can use Marshall amps with some software. And in fact, they're actually just about to release their own actual amps that have amp modeling built into them. So you can buy one Marshall code amp and it's got like 10 different Marshall models built into it. So like the way I look at it is if you use an Amplitude or something like that and you see like the brand name in there, it's probably going to sound pretty close. So like the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier, for example, which is like the sound that anyone who's listened to metal will have heard. That actually does sound pretty close to a dual rectifier. It doesn't sound exactly the same. But again, if you the difference between kind of sounding like a dual rectifier and not having any form of dual rectifier, you're, quite a lot further ahead with this. Right. so yeah, so it's pretty cool. I'd say, if you're a musician listening to this and you want to check it out, I think it's a good option. But if you want a serious like recording setup, you're probably going to want something else because, it's not just plugging an input in that you need in an audio interface. You might want multiple headphone outs or audio outs and things like that, of which this is definitely a cheap model. And I have not tested it on Linux, so I have no idea whether this thing actually works on Linux. So it made it.
Did you, when you bought this, did you think, are you the thing which does roughly what this does? Here is the thing which does roughly what this does, and buy it? Or did you look at this and the competition and this was better?
I looked at some other ones as well. I basically sat down and I was like, I just want to sit on the couch and play guitar. And if I can plug it into my iPad, that's brilliant. And I actually started looking at
acoustic guitars work without any iPad at all, right? Or do you just not want to sound like Dell Elementary?
Well, I'd prefer to, it's very difficult to learn the solo from the acoustic guitar. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely wanted that flexibility. There are lots of other options, but one of the things I like about the iRig Pro is that, like I said in the review, it comes with cables to plug it into an iPad, but I can also plug it into my Mac as well. And I'm sure you can get like other cables for plugging it into Android devices and whatever else. So it's the flexibility that I was mainly looking for. And this seems to be definitely near the top of the tree. So.
The OpenShot's a video editor, have just put out a new, big, exciting version 2.0, and they're terribly proud of it. And when I was looking at it, I noticed that their main method of distributing it to Linux users is with a thing called app image, where you just download this app image, and it is the long-fabled, runs on every Linux distribution, here's one executable, just click here, distribution device.
Yeah,
they are not... App Image is a separate project, apparently. They are not the first people to have this idea. We should say.
Here it comes. Here it comes.
I'm not saying
We're going to talk about Roxfiler.
We're not going to talk about the Roxfiler. Shut up.
Could we talk about Roxfiler? Because I wouldn't mind.
Well, to be clear, the first time John and I had this discussion on a podcast about how this would be a good idea was nearly a decade ago. But we still haven't got there. But you've got things like XDG app from GNOME. You've always had things like Click, KLIK packages and so on.
This is Click.
App Image is under the covers.
It's
the old Click
is the direct predecessor of App Image.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't even realise that.
Yep.
I was reading about all the technology. They didn't say that very clearly. But yeah, so there's a whole bunch of people trying this, but now we're starting to see people adopting it. Obviously, with the GNOME platform pushing XDG app, we're likely to see a reasonable amount of adoption of that from GNOME-specific apps, at least. Someone like OpenShot, in the immensely small pond that is third-party distributed open-source Linux desktop applications, OpenShot's a reasonably big player. So the fact that they've adopted this is encouraging. And I've got the same question I've always had with this. Is it a good idea? And if upstream start doing this, what are distributions even for? Do we need them anymore?
Now, I don't know a lot about this and how this works, but so maybe some of you can answer these questions. But when you download OpenShot as an example, right? Mm-hmm. And if I remember correctly, OpenShot uses KDE libraries and stuff to run. Is that still the case?
I don't know the
anyone
answer
know?
to that.
I don't use OpenShot.
I don't
OpenShot
think so.
itself.
No.
I think you're thinking
I'm thinking
KDN
of
Live.
KDK. You're thinking of KDN.
I'm thinking of
Live.
KDN Live.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of KDN
Yes.
Live. So OpenShot will have a set of dependencies like any application.
Word.
Do you get, like, is it basically, like, do you get all that with it? I mean, is this basically just a massive statically compiled binary that's got everything built into it?
This depends on whether we're talking about app image or one of the other things. Some of these approaches, like XDG app, kind of mandates a runtime layer. And you're allowed to depend on the runtime layer. And if you want anything outside the runtime layer, you bundle it with your app. Click packages, CLICK, on the Ubuntu phone work the same way.
Yeah,
there is the
yeah.
runtime, and then if you want anything outside the runtime, you bundle it. App image, as far as I'm aware, I mean, technically there's a runtime in the sense that it's got to be on a Linux machine. You've got to have X or whatever. But there's very, very minimal runtime requirements. You bundle everything. I believe OpenShot 2.0 bundles GTK. I'm not sure about that.
I think they do.
App image may mandate a version of GTK, but consider it's almost impossible to run an app on some arbitrarily chosen version of GTK. I believe it bundles it.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that OpenShot, what's the most recent version that they've released? 2.0.7,
2.0
right?
was very recent.
Yep.
Right, so I'm assuming that, for example, the OpenShot 2.0 app image will install to /opt/ OpenShot /2.0, and
No, it never installs
2.07
anything in
will
opt,
install all the
'cause
same.
it doesn't require root privileges, so it installs everything in your home directory.
Yeah.
Okay, so but what I'm saying is I'm assuming that each version. So I'm assuming that if you have three different, if you install 2.0, then 2.0.1, then 2.0.7. I'm assuming that those three downloads of the app image will install in three different directories, and each will bundle the GTK library 3 additional times, right? So you could run three separate versions. You could still run 2.0, or you could run 2.0.7 because they're just two completely different
they're all parallel.
installations.
Everything's parallel installable.
Right.
Yeah.
So this gets, like you said, gets back to the question of does it make sense to ship the individual dependencies with the application, or should you have one installation of the GTK runtime and then you upgrade that?
This is exactly the same question that everyone's had since the beginning. Right? You know, what if there's a security hole in libpng and now every application developer has to do a new version of their application? And you think, that would be terrible. I mean,
that's a legit
I don't know how
concern,
every other operating system has survived and become massively more dominant than us, despite having this incredibly big flaw, which is a flaw, to be clear.
To be fair, those other massive operating systems do tend to be a little bit more insecure. So it's a fair criticism. It's not. But I think, have you guys used PCBSD much? Because they've got a similar kind of package thing over on PCBSD where basically the package brings with it all of the dependencies. So all of the libraries it needs, everything, the specific versions come with it. And it is an absolute dream to use. It is so fucking convenient. It makes your head want to explode with orgasms. It's fantastic. And you never have to worry about crap. And what's really great is you get stuff running once, 10 years from now, it's going to still be working. Your application is not going to get instantly outdated. As an example, I've released many pieces of software in my life. The vast majority of Linux binaries I have released no longer run on any modern distribution at all. And Ubuntu and Debian is the worst offender in that regard.
Is this an argument for or against?
This is an argument for, because if the packaging had been done in something like Click, in something like this, those pieces of software would, in all likelihood, still be working in the exact same way that they worked 10 years prior. And so it doesn't have that planned obsolescence. Part of the problem with the Linux software ecosystem we currently have is software is, by the way it's designed, not obsolete and completely unusable within a short handful of years if you're upgrading your operating system. And that's a real problem.
I think recently there were a couple of very specific jumps in things like glibc that caused a lot of older stuff not to work. But more recently, I think that's something in general has really been improved.
As an example, try going back and using a 5-year-old version of Firefox on a modern
not even Firefox, right? Linux Tycoon, released by Bryan Lunduke Software, whatever the hell it was called. Right? I was playing with it a couple of months ago for various reasons, and I can't get the Linux version to run, so I run the Windows version under Wine, which works fine.
Yes,
we're better at running Windows software than we are running our own software from 5 years ago. I know it's ridiculous. I should be clear. The app image format specifically, Jono, you said it installs into this file. It doesn't install at all. It all stays in the one file.
Yeah.
So it's not like a deb where it unpacks into a folder. It's just one file, and you just put that file wherever you like. So it's app.dirs, hooray, from the rock.
And I would actually, I'd actually go a step further as well and say, I think we can thank the Debian project for much of the culture that we have in how Linux software is packaged. And to be fair to the Debian crew, they did amazing work in putting that together.
Yeah.
So I would say that if you are building software that fits within, if you're absolutely willing to be part of that ecosystem and to support it and make your and upgrade and make your changes and all the rest of it, then it makes sense. In the same way that the GPL works well, because anything you create has to be, any additions have to be licensed in a similar kind of way. So if you're working within that world, the Debian archive I think works well. The problem is that most people who are building software today are not building it as part of the Debian project or as part of the Ubuntu project or as part of the Fedora project. It's general purpose. So it seems like even though technically it might be a better way, it just doesn't scale to what the world needs.
I mean, I think everyone would agree that glibc should come from your distribution, and probably Bash.
And where do you draw the line? What about something like OpenSSL? Where do you put that?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, I think it's very clear on either end of the scale, right? So something like Bash comes from your distribution. Something like Atom, for example, the GitHub editor probably doesn't, and that's packaged as an app image as an example. So something which is very clearly a third-party app. The blurry line comes in certainly with things like SSL, which are clearly infrastructural pieces.
Right.
But if you start saying, well, okay, my application shouldn't bundle infrastructural pieces, what counts as an infrastructural piece? Then you end up defining all of Debian as being infrastructure.
Right. And especially in the case of something like OpenSSL, or if you use LibreSSL, whatever, the version makes a huge difference.
What I find interesting about this is that argument, because I was involved with the development of the Click project on Ubuntu, the bit that gets missed out, and people are like, well, Click on Ubuntu is exactly the same as this. And you're like, it isn't, because that's for third-party apps, yes, and you bundle your own libraries, yes. But one of the flat-out requirements for Click package is that they are sandboxed. They will the Ubuntu project will only deploy Click. This is why you can't run Click packages on the Ubuntu desktop. You can only run them on the phones.
Right.
Because they have to be sandboxed, which means from Ubuntu's point of view, you need Mir. Now, XDG app, again, I believe they're requiring the sandbox to be in place. Because at that point, if you say, what if there is a security hole in the version of libpng that I bundle with the application? The answer is, okay, that's a problem, but it's not a serious problem because your app's sandboxed. It becomes a problem when you ship Firefox, install it as root, and it has a security hole in it, and that can't be upgraded by the distribution. So I think this kind of single package disassociated from the distribution infrastructure is okay as long as you've got security sandboxing in place.
I don't even know if it's necessary.
App hasn't.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't even know that it's 100% necessary. If you had, let's say, a base system, let's say you took a base system of Ubuntu, right? And certain things, your shell and a few other of the common utilities came through apt or snappy or whatever the hell Ubuntu wants to ship it to you with right now, right? That's fine. And then have all of the big common user applications come through something like this, where they're portable applications with all of their dependencies met, and that you can get it through one singular user interface, whether it's GNOME software, Ubuntu software set, or a website, whatever. You can basically make it so that there was a singular application store repository that people could get their userland applications from, and it would be the exact same repository of software for every single version of Ubuntu on the planet because of the way it would be designed. And that would be kind of a burden relief for both the Ubuntu community, who wouldn't have to now worry about testing and repackaging all of their software and all those thousands and tens of thousands of packages over and over and over again for every 6 months for a brand new version of the distro. Plus, it would make it easier for third-party developers to make sure that people keep their software running.
I mean, I think that's basically the plan that they've got with Click packages, right? Is that you get the OS, and then anybody can create Click packages and ship them and upload them to the store.
But the distinction between them, I think, and something like certainly App Image and partially XDG App, is that Click has a runtime. Not just the runtime that the applications need at runtime to use it, but the whole install infrastructure, which is technically distro agnostic, and there's nothing stopping anyone else implementing it, but nobody else has. The App Image people who came from Click, as Jeremy said, have gone the opposite approach. They've gone, it is our job to help you to build packages that work everywhere. Right. So you can just take an open shot App Image and run it on SUSE today, and it works. You don't have to say, why don't we get SUSE to bundle the App Image runtime first? Which is where things like auto package always fell down. Because they never got enough mindshare to have everyone standardise on bundling the runtime, especially since a lot of people are like, that's just a competitor to Debian. We don't want that.
So
Stuart,
it comes down to... Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jeremy. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think it comes down to the question of who do you think is going to be long-term more reliable, keeping apps up to date? A few distribution manufacturers or a bunch of third-party software developers?
I might have answered this question differently if we hadn't this week seen Jamie Zawinski complaining about Debian's bundling, Debian's packaging of X Screensaver.
Yeah. Among other applications, including OwnCloud and a bunch of other problems that are all projects that are having the same problem.
For those of us who haven't heard what Jamie Zawinski said, can you summarize?
Right, summarizing. Zawinski is unhappy because Debian's policy on stable, is they package a version that goes into the stable distribution and it doesn't get touched again. They backport security patches to that existing version. Yep. What that means is quite a lot of stuff in the Debian stable distribution is years out of date. What Zawinski doesn't like is that then people email him and say, you're the owner of X Screensaver. I've got this terrible bug with it. And he says, yeah, you had that terrible bug with it. I fixed it 3 years ago. It's not my fault. It's Debian's fault. Blame Debian. And he's now got to the point of saying, I would like Debian to stop packaging X Screensaver, please, because I am sick and tired of this.
That's awesome. And the OwnCloud people are having something similar where because of the Debian packaging policies, the people's choices, if they're running Debian for OwnCloud, are either use a crazily out-of-date version or upgrade to a new version in such a way that the packages will actually break OwnCloud because the packaging in Debian doesn't follow the rules that OwnCloud needs in order to have a smooth upgrade. So there's a lot of packages that are having similar problems right now.
I mean, to be clear, for every time you can point a finger at Debian or at Fedora or at Ubuntu and say, this is a time where they've screwed up upstreams, there's a whole bunch of times where you can point at upstreams and go, here are upstreams who don't care, and that's been fixed by the tender mercies of the Debian maintainer, right? So this is 6 of one and half a dozen of the other.
It really is.
This comes down to a mentality thing again, but from my opinion, running Debian stable on a desktop is just asking for trouble.
Why the hell would you X Screensaver on a Debian stable machine?
Stable
I don't
server,
get it.
Phenomenal idea. Makes a lot of sense, right? You don't want to have to worry about it. They backport security features. Great. So, but coming back to your original question and the intro of this segment was, do distributions matter? And I think because you kind of have something like Debian stable and Debian testing and, unstable, depending on what you as a person are looking to do, I think distributions do matter, and I think server versus desktop matters as well. I could see for some specific third-party desktop applications, App Image makes a ton of sense.
I mean, yes. Obviously, an awful lot of the stuff that I run on my machine now, I get from a third party. I mean, the application I spend more time in than anything else is Chromium, which I get from Google. The one I spend the second most amount of time in is Sublime Text, which I get from upstream. Right? Those two applications by themselves are probably 60%.
Is that a new thing or something you've found yourself doing for years?
Well, I have no opportunity with Sublime because it's closed source, so it's not packaged by Ubuntu, unsurprisingly. But things like Telegram In general, I find if I want an application that's a reasonably modern, recent application, it won't be packaged anymore. I mean, I don't know whether... And some of this is because, the Telegram desktop client, while it's open source, they probably don't match some detail of Debian, or there's no Debian maintainer who steps up and wants to do it because the Telegram server's closed source or whatever. But a lot of the stuff that I'm running, I get from the upstream anyway. And I download a deb, and it's quite convenient for me that I'm running Ubuntu, and therefore that's what everyone packages for. I remember the days when you could download a package from a website, it was always an RPM, and I was really annoyed as a Debian user. Now it's the other way around. But it must suck if you're a Fedora user and everyone just offers debs for download or compile from source, and that's the only option you've got.
The thing is, as well, is I'm glad. One of the things I like this whole app image thing is, I remember when I was at Canonical, there was always a impedance mismatch between the expectations and the needs of upstream and downstream, and then to the side of that of like what we'd call partners. So, for example, I remember Sun working with, we worked with Sun around Glassfish, right? And back in the early days of Ubuntu, and it's still the case with Debian, you have to get that software in before a certain freeze date. And then once it's released, you can't release it into the archive. So the traditional Debian archiving approach is heavily dependent on freeze dates, and it's very difficult to deliver updates out like for an existing OS. And so it's easier in Debian because it's essentially a rolling archive. But in Ubuntu, it was complicated. And then of course you're expecting these people who want to get their software into your archive to know how to package with Debian, which is non-trivial. So one of the things I like about this is clearly that packaging model isn't necessarily going to work in today's kind of world of people want the latest stuff. I think that's the thing. I mean, imagine I wanted to use some kind of modern editor, right? Modern text editor as a developer. I might pick Brackets. I might pick Atom. I might pick Sublime Text. I might pick VS Code from Microsoft. Right? There's 4 reasonably popular big picture editors. Sublime is closed source, so leave that to one side. But the other 3, as far as I'm aware, Atom's open source, VS Code is open source, Brackets is open source. And as far as I'm aware, none of them are packaged for Debian or Ubuntu. That sort of thing doesn't seem to fall into it doesn't even seem to me like a thing that Debian packages would package. It feels obvious to me that I get Atom from atom.io and not from Debian. Right? Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where we often, like, Linux people often kind of reminisce and say, we had the App Store before the App Store was a thing because we've always had these archives, which conceptually is true, but in reality it really isn't, because the hard thing is getting those updates to people securely. The question about the app image thing is, it sounds like this could be rife with security issues, right? Surely this is opening up... I mean, this is basically the Windows approach where you download something and run it on your computer.
It's not just the Windows approach. It's the pretty much every operating system on the planet approach. I mean, realistically, this is the DOS approach, the Amiga approach, the Atari approach.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
fine.
I mean, I
wasn't counting a fucking Atari, for God's sake.
If you're not counting Atari, you're doing it wrong. I don't know.
Well, Mac is sandboxed.
That'd be the case.
Android apps are sandboxed.
You
download a .exe file off the internet, it is not sandboxed.
Yes.
So it sounds like this is that model, and wouldn't that open us up to security issues?
It totally would.
Yes, it would.
Yeah. It would, but is the benefit worth it? And realistically, if you could always do it from the approach of have the operating system, have Ubuntu say, you know what, we're going to bless app image. We're going to build our Ubuntu Software Center. All of our packages are going to be app image packages now. And now everything's curated and vetted and verified from reliable developers and sources. And we just have more flexibility and more reliability that our software will work into the future. And that seems like an awesome thing to me. Also, Roxfiler is rad, and I hope it makes a comeback.
So I think we have a lot of Linux. Well, we have, I think, a mix on in the Bad Voltage community forum. So I'd love to hear from people what they think of this. Like, do you like the app? Well, first of all, do you like the app image approach? And if you don't like it, what approach do you like and why? Like, I'd love to hear, because I bet we've got a multitude of, some people will think we should be sticking with the repositories approach, and some people will be thinking, we should be doing these other things. So
I would also be interested in people have they actually used community.badvoltage.org to finish his thought there. But I'd also be interested to hear are people actually using AppImage? Like, what percentage of current people listening to the show have installed ever at least one AppImage?
Yeah, and I'd really like to see this discussion go beyond people saying, "Oh, but if you statically bundle all your libraries, then there's security problems." Versus, "But I want to distribute to all Linux things." That discussion's been had a million times. People on either side are not going to agree with one another.
Actually, since I just asked the community, have the three of you, have any of you installed something before this? We discussed doing this for the show via AppImage.
Yeah.
I installed OpenShot.
Yeah, OpenShot and a couple other things just playing with it. But OpenShot's the first one that I installed because it was distributed like that.
Okay. So yes, no. And
also, while we're on the topic, while we're on the topic of other things we could ask people to talk about in the forums, I'm really curious what people's thoughts are on Supergirl, because I've been watching that show with my daughter and I want to like it.
This isn't
but
the outro, this is an actual
I'm having a hard time.
Specific topic.
I recognize it, but I'm going to forget about this by the time the outro comes around. It's like half the time a good show, the other half of the time it really makes me mad. So go to community.badvoltage.org, and if you don't want to talk about AppImage, feel free to talk about Supergirl.
So we were supposed to have a guy called Gianfranco Cessalini, who is from the Mod Duo project, and sadly, Gianfranco had to postpone at the last minute due to some technical issues. So hopefully, we're going to try and get him on the next show. They're building this really interesting. It's like a guitar pedal that's powered by open source and an open standard for guitar effects. It's actually really cool. They did a Kickstarter campaign, and actually, I backed this Kickstarter campaign, so I might be able to review it for the next.
That'd be pretty
episode.
cool. That'd be pretty cool.
But it should be arriving while I'm out this week. So. Yep, sorry we can get you on, Gianfranco, but it's kind of your own fault.
Speaking of open source,
what else is going?
Speaking of open source and Kickstarter campaigns, the Mycroft people have just shipped their first device.
Nice.
Although it's their early bird hardware developer kit. It's all 3D printed and stuff. It's not the real one, which is what I'm getting. So
yeah.
So I'll let some other people who are prepared to pay twice as much money as me test out the first version of the hardware with all the bugs in it, and then when that's fixed, I get it and it'll just work, which is excellent.
Did you see that it's going to have Alan Pope's voice?
Yeah, I did. In fact,
is it really?
That's Popey is providing the voice for it.
Oh no!
Part of me loves that, and part of me hates that, and I don't know which part to give into at this point. Honestly, I think I love it. I think it's great. I
think I'm going to go out and buy some, like, you can buy from like dollar stores those fake beards, and I'm going to stick two on either side, so it's like Popey's sideburns that are sticking on the side of my Mycroft when it ships. For those of you who don't know who Alan Pope is, this is going to be very uninteresting.
Very, very uninteresting.
He's a member of the Ubuntu UK podcast. So
I kind of feel like we should make a set of like a voice pack. I don't even know how it works within their system. That's like the bad voltage version. So that way it sounds like us yelling at each other all the time. That's fantastic.
I will tell you how it works. There's a project called Vocal ID. Well, I'm not sure if it's Vocal ID or Vocalid.
God damn it!
but what they do
is a terrible joke, and I hate that I laughed at it.
What they do is they get you to read. They try to build up a huge voice corpus, and so they've got kind of an online thing that runs in the browser where it gets you to read sentences. And I thought, I'll have a go at that, and I'll read a few sentences. And I read 200 or 300 with no end in sight, and I think there might be thousands to read.
Seriously?
But their whole idea is that they're getting a really comprehensive thing. Part of the reason why people say, why aren't there any decent open source voices, is because it's loads of work.
So wait, if you do go through the whole thing, then I can download an ACK pack and have everything.
An ACK pack.
As I understand it, it's not 100% clear. What Mycroft have partnered with the Vocalid people, but I do not know whether they've just taken a few Alan Pope phonemes and poked them into the voice they're going to use, or whether Pope's done the whole entire thing and they're using
He better
his
did
voice.
the whole thing. Come on.
And it's also not clear to me whether, if someone goes through all of this, you get a downloadable voice which you can switch into your own Mycroft. So we could have like a Jeremy Garcia Mycroft,
right?
How
badass would that be? That'd be so badass.
But I appreciate the fact that this is in line with most bad voltage discussions, which is we don't know what we're talking about. But
I know a bit about
but
this.
But
I sat there and read,
let's be clear here.
We will have Mycroft soon, so we'll be able to figure it out.
Yes.
This is the important part. Jono, this was not fair. I don't know what I'm talking about. Stuart, on the other hand, seemed to understand it completely well. So let's not lump Stuart in with the rest of us here.
I was under the impression that when you build a voice corpus, it's matching what you're supposed to say with the way it's been said, and the tone of the voice doesn't map to that. It
Remember, they're not
the
just,
way in which you say it.
They're not just using this to build a corpus for text to speech. They're using it to build a corpus for speech to text as well.
I honestly had no idea how you make it sound a certain way.
Wait a minute. So am I going to have to talk like Popey in order for Mycroft to understand me?
No.
That sounds horrible.
Like I say,
I'm going to walk around the house sounding like Popey all day.
The whole point in having a really big, freely open source of voice data is so they can draw on it to do things like build new voices to read things out, but also better understand it when you speak to them.
Right.
So,
you don't want to have to say bobbins every third word to be able to get it to understand what you're saying.
Hey guys, is there anything we want to tell people about before we end the show?
Yes, there is, actually, right?
Nice.
This is primarily people in the UK, I must admit. Joe Ressington.
This is entirely people in the UK.
There are apparently people coming from abroad, I don't know. But Joe Ressington, who does a couple of podcasts, actually, one about the Raspberry Pi and does Linux Luddites, has put together an evening of open source podcasty people in London. It's called Foss Talk, which is at fosstalk.com. And you've got the Linux Voice podcast people are going to be there. The Ubuntu podcast team are going to be there. The Linux Luddites team are going to be there, also featuring me. Hooray!
Can I... Hang on. Before you go on, I just want to visualize this for people who have not seen the website. I love this, right? Because it says in big letters, Foss Talk Live. And then it says underneath that, a little smaller, a free evening of live Linux podcasts, Saturday the 6th of August, 2016. Big Linux Voice logo, big Ubuntu podcast logo, big Linux Luddites logo. And then it says in small text underneath it, plus Stuart Langridge and Dave Mega Slippers. It sounds to me like you guys like a support act.
Well, part of the point here is that Bad Voltage were invited, but you guys didn't seem interested. So I said yes. I'll happily go along.
Know about it,
but it's not. It's not a Bad Voltage evening.
I was never invited.
Never heard about this before.
I was told about it between recording segments today. That is the first I've heard that this exists.
Were you plausibly going to come?
Sure.
You great big...
I will, however, be up at Linux Fest Northwest later on this month, giving a whole bunch of speeches in Bellingham, Washington, which is going to be a crazy good time. If you are in the western half of the northern part of North America, you should definitely be there. It is, I can't remember the dates. It's like April 20, late 20-somethings. I don't know. It's a weekend. It's fantastic. It's free. And you get to see my super pretty face.
So if you're in London on the 6th of August, come to Foss Talk. If you're in, where is LFNW? What's in the northwest?
Bellingham, Washington. It's just south of Vancouver, British Columbia.
Well, okay. If you're there, go and see Bryan, who is doing, I assume, something approximating Linux Sucks.
I am. This one is amazing. I'm really going really far out from my wheelhouse here. This one's called Linux is Weird. So that's pretty fantastic. That'll be happening, and it's fun. It's just going to be fun.
Alternatively, you can go to the Harrison, which is on 28 Harrison Street in King's Cross in London, and go and see Stuart Langridge and Dave Megaslippers as part of Foss Talk. Man, I love the fact that he's called Dave Megaslippers, and on his Twitter profile it says his name is Slippers Ex Machina. Okay, it's beautiful.
You know,
I think we should get Mega Slippers on
You know,
the
and
show.
He's a good
here's the
guy,
thing.
actually, Dave.
Here's the thing, everybody. If you have the choice to only go to one of these two events, do the one that's in the UK, because I do not have Dave Mega Slippers at my events at
do
all.
not.
So it's just not worth it.
Not just slippers.
Mega Slippers.
Mega Slippers. I don't know why I find that so funny.
I don't either.
Yeah.
It's fantastic, though.
It's just... It's beautiful. So, yeah. But no, that sounds cool, the Foss Talk Live thing. Hopefully they'll get a decent turnout. Good people going. Big fans of all of those podcasts. Yep. So, Linux Voice, Ubuntu Podcast, and Linux Loadout. So
I have never listened to a single one of them.
Should though.
Yeah, not one.
They're all very English. Very English.
Right. I listen.
The most English one is probably the Ubuntu Podcast, though, because it's got like the... it's got like the music that your granddad listened to when he was 30, in between the segments. That kind of bouncy, squeaky.
What did your granddad listen to when he's 30?
I don't. What style of music is that? That music that they play in between the segments. That kind of like.
Yeah, it's sort of 1940s band music.
Oh,
Big band.
Yeah,
big
it's
band stuff?
It's chap up. It's chap hop without the without the
It's,
rapping,
it's what
basically.
Chap Hop's taking the piss out of, actually.
right. So the music
It's
that I
just
listen
chap.
to. Got it. Now that I've been insulted, feel free to go to community.badvoltage.org and tell my co-hosts what raving asshats they are, and come back in 2 weeks for another amazing episode of Bad Voltage.